This is Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Inspiring and providing real insight to our listeners with every story. Exploring deep stories behind every guest. Please welcome your host, Bo Tiffany.
Welcome back to another episode of Digital Voices. We are starting our series called Epstein's Islands. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to take a look in particular at a U.S. territory called the Virgin Islands. And we're going to walk you through the history of the island, going back to its original peoples, to how that changed with the advent of slavery and its introduction to the island, and how that legacy still is pervasive within the island. And we're also going to take a look at the modern culture of the island and how that has left a vast gray area for justice, causing impunity to be had by those that wish to disobey the laws. With this first episode, I'm going to walk you through the history of the Virgin Islands. The indigenous peoples of the islands were the Chiponi, Arawak, and Carib tribes. They arrived in the region from South America and the nearby Caribbean islands. The Chiponi people were the earliest known inhabitants of the Virgin Islands. They were hunter-gatherers who lived off the land and the sea. Their settlements were small and mobile and left behind little evidence of their existence. The Arawak people arrived in the region around 200 BCE. They were skilled farmers who cultivated crops such as corn, yucca, and beans. They built large settlements with stone structures and left behind evidence of their sophisticated culture, including pottery and stone tools. The Carib people arrived in the region around 800 CE. They were known for their skills as sailors and their ability to build sturdy canoes that could travel long distances. They were also fierce warriors who engaged in battles with the Arawak people. In the centuries leading up to the arrival of the Europeans, the Carib people had become the dominant force in the region. They had established a number of settlements throughout the Virgin Islands and had formed a loose confederation of tribes. The arrival of the Europeans in the 15th century marked a significant turning point in the history of the Virgin Islands. The islands were first sighted by Christopher Columbus in 1493 during his second voyage to the Americas. Columbus named the islands after Saint Ursula and the 11,000 Virgins, a Christian legend. The first European settlement in the Virgin Islands was established by the Spanish on the island of St. Croix in the early 16th century. The settlement was short-lived, however, and was abandoned in the mid-16th century due to a lack of resources and conflicts over the local Carib population. The next European settlement in the Virgin Islands was established by the Dutch in the early 17th century. The Dutch established colonies on the islands of St. Thomas, St. John's, and Tortola. They also established plantations and began to import slaves from Africa to work the land. In the mid-17th century, the British established a presence in the Virgin Islands by taking control of Tortola. They also established colonies on the islands of Anegada, Jost van Dyke, and Virgin Gorda. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the Virgin Islands were the site of numerous conflicts between the European powers, as well as between the Europeans and the local Carib population. The islands changed hands multiple times during this period, between the British, Dutch, and Danish, all establishing colonies. The Danish eventually gained control of the Virgin Islands in the late 18th century. They established a thriving sugar economy and imported thousands of slaves from Africa to work the plantations. The Virgin Islands remained under Danish control until 1917, when they were sold to the United States. The history of the Virgin Islands from 1000 BCE to 1000 AD is one of the earliest human settlements in the Caribbean region. The islands were home to several indigenous tribes, and with the arrival of the Europeans in the late 15th century, this marked a significant turning point in the history of the Virgin Islands with the establishment of several European colonies. The Virgin Islands changed hands, and this culture, this underlying culture, started to change from the tribes and the indigenous people. Very little of the original indigenous people's cultures remains in the U.S. Virgin Islands today. The original inhabitants, who had lived there for thousands of years before European contact, were decimated by disease, enslavement, and violence, with the last of the indigenous peoples disappearing from the U.S. Virgin Islands in the early 1800s. The remnants of the indigenous culture can still be found in some places, artifacts and oral traditions. For example, the name Tiano is still used for a type of pottery found on the islands, and some place names are derived from the indigenous languages. Additionally, there are some efforts to revive and celebrate the indigenous culture through events and educational programs. However, the dominant culture of the U.S. Virgin Islands today is primarily influenced by the European colonial powers that occupied the islands. The history of slavery in the U.S. Virgin Islands is a complex and painful one, marked by inhumane treatment of millions of Africans who were captured, transported, and enslaved on plantations throughout the Caribbean. The U.S. Virgin Islands was no exception, and its history is linked with the brutal practice of slavery. However, it wasn't until the early 16th century that the first permanent European settlement was established on the islands by the Spanish. So within the space of 200 years, the indigenous people were wiped out. In the early years of the colonialization, the Spanish brought enslaved Africans to work the mines and on the sugar plantations established on the islands. However, they found the terrain difficult, and the indigenous population of the islands resisted to their efforts to enslave them, and the Spanish eventually abandoned their settlements in the Virgin Islands. But in the mid-17th century, the Dutch established a colony on the island of St. Thomas, which was used as a base for their operations in the region. They brought large numbers of enslaved Africans to work on their plantations, and the islands became a hub for transatlantic slave trade. The Danish West India Company took control of St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix in the late 17th century, and they too relied heavily on slave labor to work their plantations. Slaves were forced to work long hours in the fields, producing sugar, rum, and other goods for export to Europe. The conditions on the plantations were brutal, and the slaves were subjected to physical and sexual abuse, as well as forced separation from their families and communities. Many slaves died of disease, overwork, and other causes, and the average life expectancy of a slave on the plantations was just 20 years. In the 19th century, the abolitionist movement gained strength in Europe and the United States, and pressure mounted on the Danish government to end slavery in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In 1848, the Danish governor of the islands issued a proclamation abolishing slavery, and the last slaves on the island were freed on July 3rd of that year. However, the legacy of slavery continued to shape the U.S. Virgin Islands for generations to come. The islands remain heavily dependent on the export of sugar and other goods produced by slave labor, and the economic and social structures that had been put in place during the centuries of slavery persisted long after its. Today, the U.S. Virgin Islands is a U.S. territory, and the legacy of slavery is still felt in many aspects of its society and culture. The islands have made strides in recent years to confront and address this painful history through initiatives like the National Park Service's Slave Wrecks Project, which seeks to document the history of the transatlantic slave trade in the region, and efforts to preserve and interpret the many historic sites and buildings that tell the story of the island's past. The legacy of slavery has had a significant impact on the U.S. Virgin Islands. This dark history is left with an indelible mark on the island's culture, society, and the economy. Slavery officially began in the Virgin Islands in 1672, and it was finally abolished. But the story behind that is interesting because it was a slave rebellion on St. Croix that led to the emancipation of all the slaves in the Danish West Indies. This marked the end of an era of institutionalized slavery. One of the most significant ways in which the legacy of slavery is still felt in the U.S. Virgin Islands is through its demographics. The majority of the island's population is descended from the African slaves who were brought there centuries ago. This history is reflected in the island's cultural traditions, such as their music, dance, and cuisine. The legacy of slavery is also apparent in the economic structures of the Virgin Islands. Many of the island's industries, such as agriculture and tourism, were built on the back of slave labor. Even today, the Virgin Islands remains heavily dependent on tourism, and many of the island's residents work in low-paying service jobs that are a legacy of the plantation economy. In addition to its impact on culture and economy, the legacy of slavery has also had a profound impact on the mental and physical health of the island's residents. The trauma of slavery and the legacy of racism have contributed to high rates of stress, depression, and other mental health issues among the island's population. The health impacts of slavery are also apparent in the high rates of chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension that are prevalent amongst the island's population. In recent years, there's been a growing awareness of the legacy of slavery in the Virgin Islands and efforts to address its impacts. One such effort is the creation of the Virgin Islands Reparations Movement, which aims to secure reparations for the descendants of slaves who were brought to the islands. The movement seeks to redress the economic, social, and psychological harms that were caused by slavery and its legacy. In conclusion, the legacy of slavery has had a profound impact on the U.S. Virgin Islands, shaping its culture, its economy, and society in numerous ways. Although slavery was officially abolished over a century ago, its legacy continues to be felt by the island's residents. By acknowledging and addressing this legacy, it is possible to begin the process of healing and creating a more just and equitable future for the Virgin Islands and its people. I think the story of the emancipation is notable, which I mentioned earlier, and I wanted to touch on that. The fire burn was a slave rebellion that occurred on St. Croix, which was then part of the Danish West Indies, now the United States Virgin Islands, in 1878. The rebellion was led by three women, Mary Thomas, Axeline Solomon, and Susanna Abrams, who were among a group of enslaved laborers who were protesting their brutal treatment by plantation owners and managers. The slaves had been subject to cruel and inhumane conditions, including being whipped and beaten for minor infractions. On the evening of October 1st, 1878, the enslaved workers in several plantations on St. Croix began setting fire to sugarcane fields and buildings. The fires quickly spread, and the island was soon engulfed in flames. The Danish colonial authorities were unprepared for the uprising and initially struggled to contain the rebellion. The plantations were burned down, and many plantation owners and managers were killed by the enslaved workers. The slaves also attacked police stations and other government buildings in an effort to gain their freedom. In response, the Danish colonial government sent in troops to quell the rebellion. The soldiers were successful in putting down the revolt, but only after several days of intense fighting. As a result of the rebellion, the Danish government was forced to take action to improve the living and working conditions of enslaved laborers. In 1848, the Danish government had already abolished the transatlantic slave trade and prohibited the importation of slaves to the colony. However, it wasn't until after the Fireburn incident that the Danish government enacted reforms that eventually led to the emancipation of all slaves in the Danish West Indies. I think that's important. The legacy of the Fireburn Rebellion is still felt in the U.S. Virgin Islands today, and it should serve as a reminder of the struggle for freedom and the equality in the face of oppression. The rebellion is commemorated every year at a public holiday at St. Croix, and the three women who led the revolt, Mary Thomas, Axline Solomon, and Susanna Abrams, are revered as heroes and icons of the struggle for freedom.
This has been Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany, exploring deep stories from real-life guests with real-life experiences, providing insight to our listeners with every story. Stay up to date on future podcasts by bookmarking Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany.podbean.com and follow Bo on social media by searching Digital Voices with Bo Tiffany. Have an idea for a future story? Send your idea to acrmadison@gmail.com. Until next time, grab life by the horns and keep inspiring others.